I'll help clean things up.
I can go with you. Huh?
You've got something to clean up too, don't you?
Hey guys, MrPokke here, back with another video, and on today's episode of CN Unit Analysis, we are taking a look at the latest S-Rank Physical Anomaly Agent, Jane Doe. For her more basic introductions like how a character works, the character kits, some recommended builds, team comps, you can kind of check out the previous early access video. But for this specific video, we're going to be taking a look at a little bit more in-depth segments as to her rotations, how her actual performance is like with one of the other teams, as well as some of the findings that we have from the CN community. So without further ado, let's get into today's content.
Subscribe!
Alright, so the first thing that I kind of want to get across really quickly is once again how the anomaly damage is gonna be distributed when we are using Jane Doe. So this is not just for Jane Doe, for pretty much every single anomaly unit. Whenever you do a elemental or quote-unquote anomaly damage to the enemy, so for NB it could be Shock, Grace, Seth, they will build up this bar, which is considered as the anomaly attribute bar, right? And once the bar reaches to the maximum, it will then add on a respective elemental damage, right? So for Jane Doe, this is going to be namely from the form of assault, which is where her majority of the damage is coming from, because her assault, as you guys see from the killers now, she can do massive critical hits using this assault trigger. So this is where majority of the units are going to be coming from, right? And the two different effects that we have for physical assault specifically is that it increases the days value received by the target for roughly 7.5%, as well as dealing this physical damage that can also interrupt the enemy's movement, right? So those are the two effects for the physical anomaly. And then this is going to be the formula for anomaly damage. So this is going to be your multipliers by your attack, your damage percentage, your anomaly rate, and then your defense, rest, vulnerability, your days multiplier, as well as your level multiplier, right? All these multipliers respectively, they have no relations to your double crits, right? So crit rate, crit damage on Jane Doe is pretty much quite useless, aside from the fact that even though her assault can crit, it is based on the flat line values, and your crit rate or crit damage will not affect Jane Doe's final assault damage whatsoever. So for Jane Doe, you just want to build her with the usual route about building DPS, does that you don't want to build crit and you want to stack on anomaly proficiency. Alright, so that is pretty much it. Now with that, keeping in mind the comparison between a anomaly DPS as well as a normal crit DPS is that your crit DPS is a little bit more influenced compared to the enemy's elements, right? So for example, if the enemies, they are weak to a specific element, then technically speaking your crit DPS will deal more damage, whereas if the enemies, they are resistant to the specific element, then your crit DPS will deal less damage, right? So they have a greater influence from the external, whereas for your assault triggers for Jane Doe and all these kind of anomaly units, they are not that influenced by the enemy's elements. One important thing to keep in mind is that every single time you trigger an anomaly for a target, they will build up this very small amount of anomaly rest, which means that it will take a little bit more to actually stack up the anomaly on the same target over and over again. So you can kind of see here, every single time you trigger an assault or whatever kind of anomaly, they're going to build up this little bit of a resistance, right? So this is for the mobs from 100% to 1.94, 1.94% every single time ascending upwards. Then this is for your elites and your boss, is going to be 2%, then 2.4, 2.11, then all this kind of stuff. You can kind of see the tables over here. Essentially, this means that the more you trigger a specific anomaly, the longer it's going to take to trigger the next anomaly. But even though the numbers might look like, oh my god, this might be pretty bad, from actual in-battle performance that I find out myself, and I'm sure you guys have also played Jane Doe enough, is that I don't really feel that bad, even if you take like 7 or 8 assaults to get rid of target, right? So they might build up this rest to the build-up of your physical anomaly or assault, but in-battle performance, I would say that Jane Doe still clears exceptionally well with or without this, right? So this might be a bit of a problem if we are going to be up against Nineveh or any future boss bosses that have an extremely high health bar that you need a lot of assaults, then it will be a bit of a problem, right? So that's gonna be that. Then jumping into, like I mentioned, I think a lot of previous people have a lot of questions as to why we run two different physical anomaly units together, right? As I mentioned, the assault damage is gonna be determined by who contributed towards this final assault. So for example, if your main DPS or main anomaly DPS Jane Doe has 10,000 points of AP, and then your hyper is gonna be only a 1,000 points, so AP is anomaly proficiency, proficiency, right? They are gonna be the ones determining as to how much final damage is applied. So if the total damage applied by Jane Doe is roughly 75%, so she contributed to the 75% of the actual assault, and then your Piper is 25%, then the final damage is gonna be 75% of 10,000 plus 25% of 1,000, which amounts to a 7,750 multiplier over here. Which is why I say when you are gonna be running Jane Doe, it is ideal that you kind of want to keep her as the sole target to be the one applying the physical assault, or at least if the next target is going to be another physical unit, then at least make their anomaly proficiency a lot higher so that it doesn't dilute the final damage. Then some of the buffs and debuffs that can benefit physical assault is going to be like Rina, Sokaku, Nicole's defense down. They can all contribute towards this physical assault final damage. One thing to keep in mind is you want to apply your buffs for the assault before the assault is actually triggered. So the moment the assault is triggered and you didn't have the buffs here, then it's going to be quite useless. Whereas for Nicole, it's not that bad because Nicole, the defense now is always going to be on the target, so you can be a little bit more liberal when you are using Nicole. But for buffers, you definitely want to get in your buffs before this assault is actually applied. So that is pretty much it for the anomaly. Then jumping into the skill distribution, you want to max out your core talent absolutely, followed by your basic, your ultimate, your skill, your dodge attack, as well as your parry. So in that order specifically. And then for Jane Doe's character kit, you can kind of check out the previous early access review, but to kind of summarize everything, you want to build up your passion stream to the maximum, which is where she's going to be dealing a lot more anomaly proficiency as well as anomaly build up, right? So you want to get to this stream as much as possible, as well as maintaining in this stream throughout the entirety of the fight so that she can deal as much damage. And then in between your passion stream downtimes, you want to start applying your buffs, your debuffs, or even using your Dazer to break the enemy so that we can instantly get back our passion stream, right? So that is essentially how it's going to be. For Jane Doe, her field time, it is also greatly dependent on the enemy that you're going to be using with. So for example, in the current shield defense 7 or the disputed node 8, if the enemies hit you very frequently, then Jane Doe can honestly be on field very long as well, right? Because the more you dodge counter, the more you stack on this passion stream. So theoretically speaking, the enemy keeps hitting you all the way. You could just use Jane Doe there for like the entirety of the fight, and then whenever the shield from 7 goes down, whatever, then just swap them back and then swap back into Jane Doe. Whereas for enemies that hit you slower, then you are going to be kind of forced to swap here between your buffers, as well as maybe contributing to a little bit more days with running a days unit. So Jane Doe's team count is definitely going to be dependent on the enemy units as well as the enemy distribution in the environment as well, right? So that's going to be that. So jumping into Jane Doe's build right now, there are honestly two different ways that we can kind of run Jane Doe with, as you can see from the previous video as well. Damage output wise, 4-piece physical is going to be dealing a little bit more damage compared to your 4-piece freedom, but then again, it also depends on how often you want to trigger your assault, right? Then if you want to talk about the times you can trigger assault, then 4-piece freedom is going to trigger at a roughly 6% speed faster than 4-piece physical, and this finding is kind of the same as the previous questions that you guys might have had, so I'm not really going to repeat myself here. It really depends on the situation. I found that as of this current environment that we are playing Jane Doe in, we don't really have an enemy that needs a lot of assault triggers. From what I've noticed is that the current shield defense, the enemies more or less die within 4 to 5 assaults, right? So 2 assaults by the time you reach your first break, which is the current shield defense, slotting your 2 assault triggers, it will usually just be the end of the enemy, and the guy is probably the guy is more or less dead, right? There is not a scenario nowadays where Jane Doe needs to stack on very high amounts of assault in order to take down the enemy, like 10, 15, 20 assaults. So the difference between both, I would say it's going to be favoring more towards the 4-piece physical, just to get that burst damage as soon as humanly possible so that you can just scare out the enemy and the enemy's dead, right? So until we get a situation where we get a more difficult enemies coming out, then 4-piece physical might be a little bit better in our current endgame environment. Then for our main stat distributions is honestly going to be exactly the same. Anomaly proficiency for slot 4, physical damage for slot 5, as well as anomaly mastery for slot 6, right? Some people have mentioned that you could run attack percentage on anomaly mastery slot 6, and the difference is going to be roughly 4% over here. This basically boils down to, do you want this mastery for Jane Doe to trigger this assault, or do you want each individual assault to trigger and deal more damage? So it's kind of like the similar argument with 4-piece physical as as well as 4-piece freedom. So it really kind of depends. So maybe just go into battle, feel the difference yourself with attack percentage or with anomaly mastery, and then come to your own conclusion. Right? For me personally, I do prefer getting this mastery just to trigger the assault a little bit more frequently. And then for a subset, it's going to be attack percentage over anomaly proficiency over pen ratio over flat attack. The reason why attack percentage is more important than anomaly proficiency is because we have a ridiculous amount of anomaly proficiency from our builds, right? We have it from our main stat slot 4, we have our W engine, we have Seth, has 100 anomaly proficiency, so that's why attack percentage is going to be a little bit more valuable here. But I would say that they are not going to be differing from each other too much. When it comes to this, whether you want to run 4-piece physical or you want to run 4-piece anomaly, I already mentioned the pros and cons, so it really depends on the boss, the situations, the team comps. Both of them couldn't really be going by that far. That being said, for your main stats, they are quite consistent. Anomaly proficiency over here, anomaly mastery of slot 6, and then this is going to be pen ratio, especially if you do give her the pen ratio W engines, right? Otherwise, physical damage is going to be completely fine. Then jumping into Jane Doe's W engine, this W engine, in my opinion, it really makes Jane Doe feel like a completely different unit, especially when you want to trigger your assaults more frequently. No other W engines right now can get this whopping 40% anomaly contribution as compared to Jane Doe. But then again, like I mentioned just now, our current endgame content, we might not feel the impact of Jane Doe's W engine because the enemy usually just dies way too quickly. So because the enemy nowadays just dying within like 5 assaults, 6 assaults, because we don't need this many assault triggers, you might just want to go for the more brute force way, like Gray's W engine, just for the highest possible damage and just get rid of the enemy, right? So this is our current environment, but from a more future outlook perspective, is the enemy gets tougher and tougher, you need more and more assault to trigger, then having any forms of anomaly mastery is going to be extremely important for Jane Doe. So this is kind of like the baseline of the calculations over here. W engine at 100%, this is going to be the craftable W engine, a very cute dinosaur at 91.03, and this is going to be another one. It says you can kind of see the differences yourself, right? Definitely do take these numbers with a pinch of salt because it is highly dependent on the actual performance. I would say that tier crafting and numbers for Zenless Zone Zero in general, it is very you can't really look at them in a vacuum because it is an action-paced game. It will depend on the environment, depend on enemies, so do take this with a pinch of salt. So two notable substitutes for Jane Doe is going to be Gray's W engine as well as the craftable W engine. They are both really good, and they pretty much gives you the highest possible assault damage compared to all of our previous W engines, right? So they are going to be the alternatives. So this is going to be another graph from another CN content creator talking about the W engines, so you can kind of see that basically numbers in Zenless Zone Zero, it is really very abstract. You really want to just use them in battle properly because numbers, they are going to be varying between different players, right? So generally speaking, Jane Doe's W engine is going to be pretty decent, and we can agree universally that it makes us achieve this assault faster, right? Much faster compared to any of our W engines. And then when it comes to the raw damage for a specific setup, we could see a potential where Gray's W engine can outperform. So for example, if we were to change slot 5 into pen ratio, because like I mentioned, pen ratio does stack, and then switching the 2-piece into 2-piece pen ratio, as well as the fact that we are using 1+1 Rena, then running Gray's signature weapon could be pretty good because Gray's main stat is going to be pen ratio. Then the more you stack on pen ratio, the better this impact is going to be, right? So there's one potential setup that players can consider if you want to run Gray's W engine or Jane. Then jump into Jane Doe's Mindscape. Her Mindscape 1 is a roughly theoretical 21% final damage increase. So between the Mindscape 1 as well as the W engine 1, if you do manage to get yourself a Gray's W engine, getting Jane Doe's M1 would technically increase the overall damage by a larger margin, right? Because of opportunity cost. Also, you also want to factor Mindscapes. They are usually more expensive than W engines, so definitely take it as you will. Now for Jane's Mindscape 2, 15% defense ignore and 50% crit damage increase. You can kind of see from the previous video, the $1 versus $2,000 Jane. This is a very big damage increase. So the CNs has calculated to be roughly a 35% final damage increase. So Jane Doe's Mindscape 2 is a pretty considerable final damage increase. Your assaults are definitely going to feel a lot more oomph when you actually proc it to the enemy. You'll definitely start to, maybe you can trigger 1 or even 2 less assaults before the enemy is destroyed. So very nice Mindscape 2 over there for Jane Doe. Keep in mind your defense reduction as well as your crit damage. They are feuds that will not get diminishing returns, especially for Jane Doe. So this is a very future-proof Mindscape, especially if you get future supports that can give us this defense down, right? Mindscape 4, not too much to talk about. It is basically a 15% final damage increase, so that's gonna be that. Then jumping into Mindscape 6. So the calculation for this Mindscape 6 is that whenever any physical units trigger an assault, you are going to instantly get this passion stream. So this combined with Mindscape 1, your Jane Doe is going to be pretty much permanently in passion stream with or without Dazer. So I believe that at this point, if you have invested into an M6 Jane Doe, then running her with a full Anomaly no Dazer team is probably going to be the best case scenario, so as you really don't have any downtime where you will want to switch off Jane Doe at all, especially with Mindscape 0. So you can really just go hyper carry Jane Doe all in the buffs, and all this damage is going to be funneled into Jane Doe, right? If the 1600% multiplier, it is honestly not that crazy. So for a 700,000 assault, you are getting a roughly 90,000 additional damage. So it is a pretty decent increase, but it's not the craziest increase. The most important thing is basically you are now permanently in passion stream. By the time you get this Mindscape 6, you are pretty much going to be completely experiencing a different Jane Doe experience compared to the rest of the Mindscapes. So this is going to be the distribution for our graphs. You can kind of see that for our Mindscape 6, even though it is like a Mindscape 6, the final damage increase might not be that much, because it is more like a quality of life improvement, because your Jane Doe is now perpetually in passion stream, right? And the final 1600% multiplier is honestly not that crazy. The Mindscape 2 is going to be the one providing the highest amount of damage increase. So for dolphins that are considering if Jane Doe's Mindscape 6 is worth it, I would say that Mindscape 2 is going to be a very good stopping point. Now we're finally going to talk about Jane Doe's team comp, but before we talk about the team comp, I kind of want to show you guys the importance of Anomaly Mastery, right? So from your 4-piece freedom, your core talents, this is why Jane Doe getting high Anomaly Mastery is going to be quite impactful, especially in future enemies. So you can see it from the left and the right. One side is going to be one with the 4-piece freedom as well as all of the Anomaly Mastery buff, and this is going to be the one without, right? So you can see that it is a pretty considerable difference. You're getting around 1/4 more of the physical Anomaly build up compared to the ones without, right? So when it comes to team building, especially for future enemies that have a much tankier health pool that you cannot just get rid of within like 2 or 3 assaults, getting this higher attribute build up would be quite important for Jane Doe. Alright, well, another thing that you guys might be wondering is when do we actually use Jane's EX skill? And I think I kind of mentioned this before in the early access review. You want to ideally use this Jane's EX skill when you are into the passion stream. So during passion stream, because you deal a lot more anomaly build up, so using this EX skill, you're going to be able to get this physical assault a lot faster compared to when you're not using the passion skill. That being said, it also kind of depends on the scenario, because for Jane Doe, her kits and rotations is really not that fixed, since she is quite reliant on your dodge counters as well. So the more the enemies hit you, you can just use the dodge counters to kind of balance it out. Whereas if this is against a very immobile target, such as this robot over here, you might even consider using your EX skill just to get into passion stream a little bit quicker, right? So that's gonna be that. And now finally, let's talk about Jane Doe's team comp. Specifically, there's gonna be 2 slots that we already have more or less made up, which is first one being Seth, second one being either a support like Lucy or a Dazer like Qing Yi. I do want to point out this one interesting thing that the CN has brought up, as well as, you know, some of the personal playing experience as well, is a potential Seth issue with Jane Doe. Now, although Sev right now is definitely going to be Jane Doe's best in slot 2, the anomaly shields, the anomaly build up, all this kind of stuff, very nice. There is one piloting issue that players might face when we are going to be using Sev, which is your 100 anomaly proficiency shield. It is triggered upon the quick assist, which is the parry, but it will not trigger the 20% anomaly build up res debuff, which is only from your enhanced heavy attack or your chain attack. So because of this, you can't really get both buff and debuffs at the same time unless you use Sev's energy to charge up his skill into an enhanced heavy attack. But if you were to do this, you can feel like the tempo of the battle is gonna be not as comfortable, because his attack chain, like I mentioned in his early access review, it is very slow, right? And this will definitely be, I would say, a little bit more uncomfortable compared to the Jane Doe playing experience, where she dodges a lot more frequently and is a lot more reactive and a lot quicker, right? So that is a potential problem that I can kind of see players might have with Seth, especially if you are going to be using Seth and Jane Doe against an enemy that can attack you very frequently, such as the current shield defense or critical Note 7, right? Because if the enemy is hitting you all the time, you pretty much are going to be dodging all the time with Jane Doe. So there's a very rarely, if ever, an opportunity for you to use Seth use his energy, and then use his heavy attack. Most of the time, you're probably just gonna at most parry with Seth and then go back to Jane Doe again, right? So that is a potential issue that I can see players have with Seth, and in the future, I would not be too surprised if we get a better alternative in this current slot, right? Nonetheless, as of this current moment, Jane Doe's best in slot teammate is still going to be Seth because he is the only one that can provide all these buffs for Jane Doe, and none of our supports really buff anomaly units by that much. So that is going to be the slot 2 of the rest. Then who are we going to be running for Jane Doe's slot 3? For the anomaly team, which is the team without a Dazer, you can consider running either Lucy or Rina. Now, especially if you have a Mindscape 1 Rina, that's when her buff outside gets considerably higher, right? So both of these are going to be excellent picks. For Rina, since Seth's parry was switched a unit to Jane, since the previous unit, Rina's buffs is going to be applied to Jane Doe as well, since it's the next unit, right? So getting the Jane Doe right in the middle can allow Jane to receive both buffs from Seth and Rina at the same time. So this is a pretty optimal hyper carry setup, especially if you do get the Mindscape 1, right? So it is quite comfortable when running Rina with Jane Doe. One good thing about this comp is that the overall rotation is gonna be very straightforward because it is basically like 99% Jane Doe, 0.5% Seth, then 0.5% Rina. They're only gonna be out, use a skill or use their parries, get in the buffs and swap out. All of the times, it is pretty much gonna be Jane Doe on the field, dodging, parrying, getting your passion stream, getting the days, and then eventually when the enemy is there, cards are out, all that kind of stuff. So that is gonna be a very optimal team that you guys can kind of consider running, right? Another very similar kit is gonna be Lucy. I would say that Lucy, especially a M6 Lucy, her buffs are extremely potent for Jane Doe. In fact, some might even consider M6 Lucy to be an even better substitute for Rina, right? Because the buffs, as well as the little piggies, they deal quite a decent amount of damage themselves. You can see they're just gang on the goon over there. So an excellent alternative. So this is gonna be the difference between a M6 plus 5 Lucy for a M1 plus 1 Rina. So this is gonna be the roughly final damage upwards, so around 7.9% higher than Lucy over here, with a Jane Doe plus Seth. Of course, like I mentioned, the math in Zenless Zone Zero, they are always gonna be in a vacuum, and it might be very far from the practical applications. So definitely do take it with a pinch of salt. And one of the reasons why I say this is because for Rina, you want to try to ensure you get the pen ratio buff up almost 100% of the time, and that is gonna be quite difficult to achieve in battle unless you have an excellent playing experience with Rina, right? So definitely do take that into consideration. However, when it comes to comfort, M6 Lucy is gonna be more comfortable compared to M1 Rina, and then this is gonna be non-M6 Lucy, right? So finally, when it comes to the difference between the actual Shogun, the play feeling, or the actual performance at the theoretical highest damage, M6 Lucy, M1 Rina into non-M6 Lucy, right? So that is gonna be the supports for Jane Doe's slot 3. If you do not have an M1 Rina, this young player thinks that we shouldn't even be using her because the buff up time for a M0 Rina is very short, almost as short as Nicole's defense down. So it is gonna be having quite a bit of downtime, right? So that's gonna be that. And then another sort of couple supports that you guys might be considering is a slot 1 Sokaku. But one thing wrong with Sokaku is that she kind of suffers a similar issue with Seth, which is her attack animations are very slow, so you kind of need to deal with that if you're going to be running Jane Doe. And also, she probably will be ran with Ellen, right? So it is what it is. Piper as a slot 3, I mentioned previously, you're going to get the assault damage dilution, so it's probably going to be not that great. Unless you get yourself an M6 Jane Doe, then this double assault team, it might actually trigger. And then jumping into pretty much like our days team is going to be the Qingyi team, and I think Qingyi is pretty much the de facto best in slot Dazer for Jane Doe because the stun damage multiplier provided by Qingyi's, it is absolutely out of this world, and it does impact our assault, and it is the absolute highest damage numbers you are going to see on Jane Doe if you do end up using her with Qingyi, right? So very excellent support. But yeah, not too much to say over here. I've already explained all this in my previous early access video. Okay, at this juncture, I also kind of want to mention the difference between Jane Doe running a stun team and a Jane Doe running an anomaly team is not to say one team is better than the other, because the findings for this CN content creator is that he still clears the current shield defense Note 7 at roughly around the same time. It really depends on the way you finally play Jane Doe as a player itself, as well as the enemy you're up against. both team comps, they have their pros and cons, and they are definitely very, very viable. It is not say one team is better than the other teams, strictly speaking. Qingyi specifically is a extremely strong pick because Qingyi just has a ridiculous stun damage multiplier increase. Whereas if you're going to be running other stun units such as like Lycon, NB, or even Koleda, then the difference might be a lot more subtle, right? And in the future, it really depends on who we are getting more as a limited anomaly that can be paired with Jane Doe. Right now, the stun team comp does feel a tad bit stronger because we do have this limited stunner that is going to be Qingyi. So in the future, if we do get another Ash rank anomaly that can pair with Jane Doe, then the anomaly team might just outperform the stun team when it comes to absolute raw damage output. And that aside, the specific thing I want to mention, which is basically the play styles, right? For a Jane Doe running your anomaly team, you are going to be playing Jane Doe as a quote-unquote full on-field DPS. You are running like a hyper carry setup, give her all of the bars from Seth as well as the other support, then Jane Doe is going to be there pretty much the entire time. If there's any downtime with Passion Stream, you kind of just have to deal with it, and you might want to consider even using your EX skill just to get into Passion Stream as soon as possible. Whereas if you are going to be using Jane Doe as a stun unit, she's a little bit more towards like the burst DPS kind of thing, so you will only want to try to use her when the passion stream is up. When the passion stream is down, slot in your stun unit and then you get it into the daze stage, and then you can slot in back into Jane Doe again. So between both teams, I would say that it really depends on how you really play Jane Doe. There is no wrong way per se to play Jane Doe, and it really depends on what you prefer as a player. Do you like her using her as an on-field like 99% of the time, or do you like to use a little bit more higher burst damage potential, especially if you run her with another stun unit, right? And with that, we have finally come to the end of today's content. Let me know what you guys in the comments below. The word of the day is gonna be knife. Yep, join Twitch, join YouTube, join Discord. Let me know how your Jane Doe experience is. All the best for your Jane Doe pulls, and I'll see you guys next time. Take care.